In the spirit, the nature of these things, I won't comment on the many parts of the paper that I really agree with. I just thought I'd throw out some thoughts and places that I think are kind of less clear and less well developed in the paper. Some of them I think are fundamental to your argument. So you claim they're instruments whose function it is, and I like the focus on function, not title as statute, treaty, and constitution. They're instruments whose function it is to transfer sovereign rights. These kinds of instruments are regulated by international law, and they require for their validity clear and express language. That's kind of step one, that there's this category. Step two is the Constitution falls in this special category of international law instruments. And then three, therefore, originalism is required. I'm going to spend a little more time on one, because three is not in my wheelhouse so much, but they're linked up. And plus, I see all the hands in the room in the air, and I think a lot of that will go to three. So first, there are instruments that transfer sovereign rights, and they're regulated by special rules of international law, and they require for their validity clear and express language. The paper vacillates here between whether this is a rule of interpretation or a rule of validity. Right, so in several places, in many places, you say, especially in the last part and in the first part, that instruments that don't follow these rules are not valid. They are effective only if they comply with specific rules. And I think the difference, I wondered a lot whether the difference between validity and interpretation, whether these are just rules of interpretation, right? Like, oh, we don't know how to interpret this treaty, it's assigning sovereign rights, we'll apply some kind of clear statement rule. That's a rule of interpretation. A rule of validity is you can't do it that way, right? You simply can't alienate property using this device. The title of the paper, I think, used to be The Original Rules of Constitutional Interpretation. Now it is The Forgotten Nature of the U.S. Constitution. And when you get to the end of the paper, I think this is really important to the response to Will and Steve Sachs's article, that these aren't just rules of interpretation. These are telling us about the nature of the Constitution. You can't actually have a valid alienation of sovereign rights without fitting them into this category. If that is not your claim, if you are simply saying the general law included these rules of interpretation, then you should take out all of the language that says that these kinds of transfers were invalid. If you are making the stronger claim, right, that trying to assign sovereign rights in this way would simply be invalid, then you actually need to adduce some evidence for that, because when you move to Vattel, he's describing them as rules of interpretation. And then if they're rules of interpretation, we have the problem, aren't they just part of the general law? And you're back in simply describing them as interpretive rules rather than something that's inherent in the essence of the Constitution. Second, this category of instruments that transfer or alienate sovereign rights by function. I wondered a lot, that's not you've adduced some interesting evidence from Vattel. It's not a category that's familiar to me, really, from the law of nations, and I had a lot of questions about what would fall into that, and what kind of statutes, in particular, would do this thing that you're describing. And so, for example, when the British Parliament conferred rights on the East India Company, sometimes by statute or sometimes by charter. If they did that in a vague way, was that invalid? Did that lack legal force? Maybe that doesn't apply because the East India Company is not fully sovereign, although it was described as sovereign. So I wanted a lot more of examples. I think colonial charters wouldn't apply because the colonies weren't sovereign. Any transfer of sovereign rights to Indian nations might fall in this category. If international law is going to do much work here, I wanted a better sense of what this kind of category of international legal instruments that aren't necessarily treaties. I was really just grappling to understand what this set of instruments actually was to which this set of rules applied. And relatedly, there's a very interesting discussion of Vattel and his description of odious legal instruments. And this is kind of where I thought this got going, like, okay, this is an odious kind of legal instrument. That makes kind of some sense as a category. The footnotes describe odious legal instruments as simply void and lacking force, any legal force. And that's the strong version of your claim as I read the paper. But there's you don't do much work with that, and this category that's created of odious legal instruments just seems to fall out of the framing era evidence. We don't see any of the Federalist Papers, or at least that you pick up. I don't see this language about odious legal instruments anywhere. So it's passingly strange to me that there was this category created in international law that you're describing that was called odious legal instruments, and yet all of these founding era materials that are, to your mind, sort of invoke these rules don't actually use the actual language that you say is important in describing this category. So on the second point, so the Constitution transfers sovereign rights from states to the federal government. I think you've got a lot of evidence of that. That's great. I absolutely, totally agree with this. And this function of the Constitution puts it in a special law of nations category. That part of it I was continued to be unconvinced by. And I didn't, again, a lot of what you're describing in this second part is true and right. It's just not supporting this particular part of your claim, which I think is the part of the claim that's doing a lot of work for the original methods, originalism. So just for example, you describe in the cases, right? So Justice Wilson in Chisholm versus Georgia, he decides that the law of nations just doesn't apply to what he's doing. And yet he says you need express and explicit language to do this. So the express and explicit language part of that entirely supports your point that you need express and explicit language. But the fact that he's concluded that international law doesn't actually apply to this makes me think, okay, there's an express and explicit language requirement in the general rules of interpretation, and then there's like another one in international law, and the international law one is giving us some special force when we try to understand the nature of the Constitution, and when we try to understand originalism as not being compelled just by originalism. Anyway, and there's more, but I will. I'll just conclude by a couple of things. I think it would be very helpful to the reader if you parsed out, so what happens to your argument about original methods, originalism, if I don't believe that this is part of international law? Like, how much have you lost me, right? Or what if I think it is just a rule of interpretation? It's not a rule of validity. It's just a way of interpreting the document. Does that make it general law? Does that just make it a general law? And you say, well, we can't do that because general law was just state law. So we can't, the Constitution doesn't bring that stuff with it, right? How could the Constitution bring those rules of interpretation with them if the rules of interpretation are just state law? I think you need international law to get around that problem, but it would be helpful to be more specific if you've lost me on the international law claim. And I have more, but I can do it by email. So Judd Campbell said that he's not writing an originalist paper, and y'all do what you want. That was a quote from the last panel. So I think this is an originalist paper. And I couldn't help when I got to the end of it. I think it is the effort to say something about original methods, originalism, that drives the historical categories that are created in this paper, rather than simply uncovering the history and finding that it has something to do with originalism.
First point, it is a rule of interpretation. It is a rule of interpretation that appears in writers of the Law of Nations, on the Law of Nations. It's a rule of interpretation that appears in writers on the common law. And the idea to clarify is that if an instrument is claimed to divest a sovereign right, the United States Constitution divests state sovereign immunity. The United States Constitution allows the United States to use a state government instrumentality to commandeer it for whatever purpose, the return of fugitive slaves and prig, to take care of low-level radioactive waste, that is a provision that would be divesting a pre-existing and well-recognized discrete sovereign right under the law of nations, and you do not interpret that instrument to do that unless it does it in clear and express terms. If it does not, then it does not. Yeah. So it's a rule of interpretation. What kinds of instruments would this apply to? You know, are there specific categories of instruments? And, you know, as Vital described these rules, he described them as applying to any of them. Clearly, a treaty could cede a sovereign right. Right? A statute could purport to divest a sovereign right. Does this statute actually regulate within the sovereign territory of another nation? Does this statute actually require the government of another nation to do something? Well, it may, but it's not going to be interpreted that way unless it makes that clear. Now, the distinction between odious and favorable provisions, it's there. It's in Gibbons, it's in Story's commentaries, it's in Tucker. Jefferson, I think, uses that in the Kentucky resolutions. I think there was a reason why people shied away from it, because a legal provision could be odious in this sense in multiple ways. One way was that it divested a sovereign right. Now, it being odious didn't mean it couldn't. It just had to be clear. But there were other meanings of odious. Is it more favorable to one party than the other that I think generated a whole host of problems that led people to shy away from odious, because that carried a lot of weight with it, and instead to just say, if a sovereign right's going to be divested, it's got to be clear. In terms of Chisholm, I think the rule is just simply operating. Sovereign immunity was a big deal, and every one of those justices made a point of saying that and I think Chisholm was a very, very difficult case under these rules, but every justice made a point of saying the citizen-state diversity clause expressly, except for Iredell, expressly authorizes a suit against a state, even if it doesn't, the state of Georgia, even if it doesn't consent, except for Iredell. Iredell said, I would not interpret the citizen-state diversity clause to do any such thing. I don't remember his exact language. It's got to be a lot clearer than this. And I don't think that characterizing it as a rule of interpretation causes the paper to collapse. If language is crafted on the understanding that this is how it will be interpreted, these are the sovereign rights. If we're going to divest sovereign rights, we better do it clearly, then it becomes inextricably a part of that instrument. I mean, could that law of interpretation sort of, go off on its own and change someday independent of the Constitution? It could. But then if you applied it back, it would generate somewhat haphazard results. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.